he's needing to manage some expectations, even with some of the staff that he's appointed. For example, Marco Rubio at the State Department. That he'll be an uber hawk on China. I think he needs to make sure that he keeps some of these credentials, that he's going to be tough on China. But of course, as we know with President Trump and his transactionalism, at the end of the day, he is aiming to make a deal. And that's why I think I say this is the first chapter of the story. We've seen how the Chinese have retaliated. I think it's a fairly modest retaliation from the Chinese that's setting up a conversation between the two leaders, and we'll see what happens from there.
President Donald Trump and his Chinese opposite number, Xi Jinping, are reported to have cancelled the scheduled phone call after China announced retaliatory tariffs on the United States. The US president had been scheduled to speak to President Xi this evening, but this was due to take place just hours after the US president imposed fresh tariffs on the world's second largest economy. China then retaliated within minutes, imposing levies on US imports and putting several companies, including Google, on notice for possible sanctions. Jonathan Berkshire Miller is Director of Foreign Affairs at the Macdonald Laurier Institute, specialising in East Asian security, and joins us now. Good evening to you, Jonathan.
Good evening, and thanks for having me on.
Well, good to have you with us. What do you think is the current state of this trade war between China and the US?
Well, I think we can learn a few lessons, even though the opening trade wars have been with quote unquote allies in many ways with Mexico and Canada. But I think it's instructive to look at those two examples as we look at China. We're basically just in the opening chapter of this book, book number 2 with Trump 2.0 on U.S.-China trade wars. And I think that how things have started is that the President Trump himself has said this is an opening salvo. So look, he put a 10% tariff on Chinese goods, in addition to the tariffs that he put in place in his first tenure, which the Biden administration, by the way, did not take off largely. So he started off relatively lightly. And I think he's needing to manage some expectations, even with some of the staff that he's appointed, for example, Marco Rubio at the State Department, that he'll be an uber hawk on China. I think he needs to make sure that he keeps some of these credentials, that he's going to be tough on China. But of course, as we know with President Trump and his transactionalism, at the end of the day, he is aiming to make a deal. And that's why I think I say this is the first chapter of the story. We've seen how the Chinese have retaliated. I think it's a fairly modest retaliation from the Chinese that's setting up a conversation between the two leaders, and we'll see what happens from there.
Last night, we saw that the prospect of tariffs on first Mexico, then Canada, was withdrawn after both countries essentially agreed to bolster their borders with the United States and take further steps to stop the flow of fentanyl and so on. But at the moment, it doesn't look as though there's going to be such an easy way out when it comes to this row with China. We've had China responding with between 10 and 15% on various fuels. We've also seen it step up tariffs on agricultural machinery, pickup trucks, some large cars. Do you think that there is a deal to be done here, or do you think that China's essentially going to play hardball on this?
Well, I think there could be some contours of a deal played out in the coming months. But the big difference, I think, between the U.S.-China dynamics and that of allies like Canada and Mexico is the pure power dynamics at play here. China, of course, needs to feel like it can save face, and Xi Jinping does not want to walk into a sort of a negotiated ambush where he feels that he's going to find something on social media that basically says that China caved, and vice versa. Of course, President Trump has to be very careful about any concessions that he provides to the Chinese side. And while the president in the United States may feel like he's relatively immune to some of the different challenges within his party, I just point to Congress and the Senate and, of course, the bipartisan consensus really on China. He has to be very careful about how much he concedes to China on a potential trade tariff conflict. And I think if you reverse that with some of the allies, I actually think it's a relief to some members of Congress when he was able to put a pause, for example, on tariffs with Canada And I think it'll be a similar story if this plays out with the European Union or Japan or South Korea. So this is the difference, is that there are other pressures, I think, around both President Trump and Xi Jinping that make it really difficult to be visually seen as compromising.
Let me just ask you about another contentious issue. The Times has been reporting that Sir Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, intends to push ahead with his deal to cede sovereignty of the Chagos Islands to Mauritius. And the Prime Minister of Mauritius has been saying this. And he said that, furthermore, that his country's got a new deal in which the UK is going to effectively double the £9 billion originally offered to the country. We know that the US has got huge objections to this because of its concerns about the military base on Diego Garcia. What do you make of what we're hearing about this deal?
Yeah, and again, I think this is going to be very interesting to see. I mean, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, before he was nominated and appointed, of course, when he was in his senatorial role, was very critical of this deal. So I think that's something to kind of put a pin in and a bookmark in. But also, if you look at some of the comments that Donald Trump's been making, be it on Greenland, closer to the Arctic, or be it on the Panama Canal, both of these examples, while very different from Diego Garcia and the Chagos, are about Chinese influence. And I think we're seeing growing Chinese influence in the Indian Ocean region. So I feel like this is going to be a very tough review that the United States administration has. And the last point on this is that they're still filling out some of the seats, some of the chairs of who's actually sitting at National Security Council seats, who's sitting in the bureaucratic posts to have these reviews. So I think the idea of this being quickly reviewed by the United States side, I think it might take a little time and more anxiety for both the UK side and Mauritius.
Jonathan Berkshire Miller, Director of Foreign Affairs at the Macdonald Laurier Institute, specialising in East Asian security. Great to talk to you tonight. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Any update on when you would speak to President Xi?
No, we'll speak to him at the appropriate time. I'm in no rush. At the appropriate
Do you think that conversation can lend itself to the type of freeze that it meant for the tariffs for Canada and
Well,
Mexico?
we'll see what happens.
Mr. President, what's your reaction to China's retaliatory tariffs?
It's fine. It's fine. We're going to do very well against China and against everybody else. Right now, they've taken advantage of the Biden administration like I've never seen. I've never seen. The deficit with China is about $1 trillion. Think of it, $1 trillion. They're using our money to build their military. And Biden let that happen.